On November the 3rd, 1979, at approximately 9:15 a.m., a woman picked up a telephone in her kitchen in Leningrad that would separate her from her children forever. Irina Volkova was 34 years old. She worked as an electrical engineer at the Svetlana Electronics factory on the Moskovsky Prospect. She had two children, Natasha, 11, and Mikhail, 8. Her husband, Viktor, left for his office in the city planning department every morning at 7:30. The children caught the trolleybus to school number 147 at 8:15. By 9 o'clock on most weekday mornings, Irina had the apartment to herself. The kitchen was small, even by the standards of a Leningrad kommunalka, perhaps 2.5 meters by 3 meters. The walls were painted a pale institutional green that had yellowed over the years. A single window overlooked the courtyard 4 stories below, where a few stubborn weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete. The phone sat on the counter near the sink, black Bakelite, heavy and solid, installed in 1976 after a 3-year wait. This was late in the Brezhnev era, a period historians would later call the era of stagnation, when the brief cultural thaw of the 1960s had frozen over into something harder and more oppressive. That morning had been ordinary. Irina made kasha for breakfast. Mikhail complained about it, as he did most mornings. Natasha ate in silence, already absorbed in a book. Viktor drank his tea, scanned Pravda, said little. The rhythm of a family, moving through its routines without friction, but also without particular warmth. After they left, Irina washed the dishes. She tidied the 2 rooms that constituted their portion of the larger apartment. She shared the space with 2 other families, the Petrovs, an elderly couple, and Mrs. Antonova, a widow who worked nights at the bread factory. They shared a bathroom and a corridor. The walls were thin. The phone rang at 9:15. Irina was standing at the kitchen counter, making a list of items she needed from the shop. She picked up the receiver on the 3rd ring. "Yes? Irina? It's me." Her sister's voice. "Yelena. Calling from Moscow." They hadn't spoken in 6 weeks. Yelena knew better than to call frequently. Viktor had made that clear more than a year ago. "Are you well?" Irina kept her voice neutral. "I'm fine. I'm calling about grandmother's recipe. You remember the one for the honey cake?" There was no grandmother's recipe. Their grandmother had died in the siege of Leningrad in 1942. The words were a code they'd established 18 months earlier, when Yelena first applied for her exit visa. "I remember," Irina said, her hand tightened on the receiver. "I need the ingredient list, the one with the special flour." Yelena's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're telling me I have 3 days to provide it." 3 days, Irina. According to interrogation transcripts declassified in 1994, this phrase, special flour, referred to documentation that the authorities were demanding from Yelena, evidence of foreign contacts, names of others seeking to emigrate. The language was absurdly transparent, designed more to convey urgency than to actually obscure meaning from anyone who might be listening. "I don't have that recipe," Irina said. "I know, but they think you do. I told them I gave it to you for safekeeping." Irina felt her throat constrict. The morning light coming through the window seemed suddenly harsh. She could hear someone moving in the apartment above, footsteps crossing the floor. "Why would you tell them that?" "Because I need to see you. I need you to come to Moscow. Today, if you can. Tomorrow at the latest." The whisper had become more urgent. "There are things I can't say on the phone." Irina understood. Yelena had lied to the authorities, invented some pretext that might buy her time. She needed Irina to corroborate the story or, more likely, She needed to warn her in person about something too dangerous to communicate even in code over a monitored line. The decision took approximately 90 seconds. In that minute and a half, Irina considered what going to Moscow would mean. Victor would be furious. His position in the city planning department required political reliability. His sister's refusnik status was already a problem in his personnel file. Any contact with Yelena endangered his party membership, his career, their apartment, everything they'd carefully constructed over 16 years of marriage. But Yelena was her sister. Her younger sister, now alone in Moscow, caught in machinery that ground people down with bureaucratic precision. Irina's hands were shaking. The phone cord stretched taut across the counter as she shifted her weight. "I'll come," she said. "I'll take the evening train." Thank you, Irina. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry. I'll see you tomorrow." She hung up the phone. The interrogation transcripts show that KGB officers reviewed the recording of this conversation on November 4th, the day after Irina's arrest. The conversation was noted as evidence of coordination between elements engaged in anti-Soviet activity. The actual content, a desperate sister asking for help, was irrelevant to the official interpretation. Irina stood in the kitchen for several minutes after hanging up. She looked at the list she'd been writing. Bread, butter, potatoes, onions. Mundane items for an ordinary week. She went to the bedroom she shared with Victor. From the top of the wardrobe, she pulled down a small canvas bag. She began to pack. Change of clothes, toiletries, her internal passport. She moved mechanically, her mind racing ahead to conversations she would need to have. How to tell Victor, what to tell the children. In the next room, separated by a wall roughly 15 centimeters thick, Mrs. Antonova was sleeping after her night shift. She would later testify that she was awakened around 9:30 by the sound of voices, a man and a woman. The woman's voice was Irina's, she was certain. The man's voice she didn't recognize, though she assumed it was Victor home unexpectedly from work. They were arguing, she said, though she couldn't make out the words. This testimony was false. Victor was documented at his office until 4:30 that afternoon, but it appeared in the official record nonetheless. What Mrs. Antonova actually heard, if she heard anything, was probably Irina talking to herself, working through the explanations she would need to provide, rehearsing justifications that would prove inadequate. By the time Natasha and Mikhail returned from school that afternoon, arriving home as they did every day at 2:45 and 3:05 respectively, the trajectory of their lives had fundamentally changed. They didn't know it yet. They wouldn't fully understand for months, but the future that had existed at breakfast that morning, ordinary, constrained, but stable, had been replaced by something else entirely. Their mother had made a choice. The consequences would unfold over years, across borders, through prison cells and courtrooms, and the small airless rooms where families come apart. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1976, the Volkovs had appeared to be a model Soviet family. Irina had graduated from Leningrad Polytechnic Institute in 1967 with a degree in electrical engineering. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a factory foreman and a secondary school mathematics teacher. Her grades were excellent. Her political reliability was unquestioned. She met Viktor Volkov at a Komsomol dance in October of that year. They married in April 1968. Natasha was born in December of the same year. Mikhail in April 1971. Victor was 38 years old in 1976. He worked in the Leningrad City Planning Department, where he reviewed construction proposals and housing allocations. The position was neither prestigious nor powerful, but it was stable. It came with certain privileges, priority in the housing queue, access to better shops, the possibility of advancement. He had joined the Communist Party in 1972 after the required probationary period as a candidate member. The admission was carefully managed, requiring recommendations from 3 party members in good standing and a review of his entire employment and educational history. Their apartment occupied 18 square meters in a kommunalka on Moskovsky Prospect. The building dated from the 1950s, 5 stories of grey concrete block construction. The Volkovs had 2 rooms, a bedroom, and a combination living room and kitchen. They shared the bathroom with the Petrovs and Mrs. Antonova. They shared the hallway, the telephone, the sense of living always within earshot of others. The Petrovs had occupied their single room since 1954, Mrs. Antonova since 1969, following her husband's death. The arrangement was typical. According to housing records from the period, the average living space per person in Leningrad was 5.8 square meters. The Volkovs had 4.5 meters each. By Soviet standards, they were not doing poorly. Photographs from this era, catalogued in KGB file 7821L and declassified in 1996, show a family at ease with itself. One image, dated May 1976, depicts the 4 Volkovs at a pioneer camp ceremony. Natasha, 7, wears her red neckerchief. Mikhail, 5, stands slightly apart, already demonstrating the independence that would characterize him. Viktor's arm rests on Irina's shoulder. Everyone is smiling. But by 1976, there was already a complication. Irina's younger brother, Alexei, had applied for an exit visa to Israel in March 1974. He was 28 years old, a research chemist at the Institute of Macromolecular Compounds. His application was denied in June of that year. He reapplied in September. Denied again, the refusals came with consequences. He was dismissed from the institute in November 1974. His name went on a list. The list was not published anywhere, but everyone understood it existed. Alexei became what was known as a refusernik, someone who had been refused permission to emigrate and who existed thereafter in a kind of legal limbo. He could not return to professional work. He could not leave the country. He was periodically summoned for interrogations about his contacts with foreign nationals, his reasons for seeking to abandon the socialist motherland. The refusernik movement had been growing since the early 1970s, following a brief period when emigration, particularly Jewish emigration, had been cautiously permitted. Tens of thousands had left. Then the restrictions tightened again. Those who had applied and been refused found themselves trapped, marked as unreliable, subject to surveillance. Irina was not Jewish, neither was Alexei. Their mother had been Jewish, though she'd never practiced the religion and had married outside the faith. Under Soviet law, which followed the father's nationality, Irina and Alexei were Russian. But the maternal connection was enough. It appeared in their documents. It created questions. Viktor's position required that such questions not exist. The distancing began gradually. Family gatherings became less frequent. Alexei was not invited to Mikhail's 5th birthday celebration in April 1976. When Irina protested, Viktor explained the reality with patience that barely concealed his irritation. Her brother's status reflected on him specifically. His party membership was recent, still probationary in all but name. Any association with politically unreliable elements could derail his career. Irina understood. She hated understanding, but she understood. She continued to see Alexei, but privately. She met him at cafes in districts far from where they lived or worked. She kept the contact minimal and never mentioned it to Viktor. She told herself this was enough, that she was maintaining family loyalty while protecting her husband's position. Relatives interviewed decades later recalled the tension that pervaded family occasions during this period. Irina's sister Yelena, who was then studying linguistics at Moscow State University, described a dinner at their parents' apartment in late 1976. Victor had attended, Irina had not. Someone asked where she was. Victor said she was ill. Everyone knew this was not true. No one challenged it. The children sensed something, though they lacked the context to interpret what they sensed. Natasha, interviewed in 2003, remembered asking her mother why they never saw Uncle Alexei anymore. Irina told her he was very busy with work. Natasha accepted this explanation but noted, years later, that she'd stopped asking after her mother's expression. A tightness around the eyes, a forced smile, made it clear the question caused pain. Mikhail remembered less. He was younger, more absorbed in his own world, but he recalled that adult conversations would sometimes stop abruptly when he entered a room. He felt the presence of subjects that could not be discussed. The last gathering of the extended family before the isolation became complete occurred on May Day, 1977. The occasion was a celebration at Irina's parents' apartment. Alexei was there. So was Yelena, home from Moscow. Victor attended, though he stayed only an hour, citing work obligations. Photographs from that day show people arranged in formal groups. Everyone is smiling in the pictures, but relatives later described the atmosphere as strained. Victor barely spoke to Alexei. Irina spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen with her mother. The children played in the courtyard, unaware that this would be the last time the family occupied the same space. Within 3 months, Yelena would file her own application for an exit visa. The application set off a chain of administrative consequences. She was summoned to the university and questioned about her intentions. Her academic standing, which had been excellent, came under review. Questions were raised about a paper she'd written on Western linguistic theory. Her loyalty was questioned. She was not expelled immediately. The process was slower, more bureaucratic, but the direction was clear. By the end of 1977, her options for remaining at the university had narrowed to a point where departure seemed inevitable. Irina watched her siblings disappear into the machinery of state disapproval. Alexei had already been ground down, reduced to menial work under constant surveillance. Now Yelena was following the same path, and there was nothing Irina could do without endangering Victor, without risking their apartment, their children's education, the entire structure of their lives. She made a different choice then. She chose survival, stability, the protection of what she still had. She saw her siblings rarely. She did not speak about them. When co-workers asked about her family, she mentioned only Victor and the children. This was the bargain she struck. It seemed sustainable. It seemed like the only rational response to an irrational system. But in November 1979, when the phone rang at 9:15 in the morning, the bargain fell apart. Yelena's urgent whisper cut through all the careful distance Irina had maintained. The choice Irina had made in 1976, the choice to protect her immediate family by abandoning her siblings to their fate, was replaced by a different choice. One she would make in 90 seconds, one that would cost her everything. Irina's sister, Yelena, had been trying to leave the Soviet Union for 18 months. She was 29 years old in the autumn of 1979. Unmarried, a linguist specializing in Romance languages, with particular expertise in French and Italian. Before March 1978, she had worked as a junior researcher at the Moscow Institute of Foreign Languages, analyzing syntactic structures in contemporary French literature. The work was academic, politically harmless, exactly the kind of specialized research the Soviet system both required and tolerated. She filed her application for an emigration visa on March 14, 1978. The application cited family reunification, a distant cousin in Paris whom she'd never met, but whose existence could be documented through correspondence her grandmother had preserved. The cousin's name was Sarah Bernstein. The correspondence dated from 1936. The response came on April 2nd. Application denied. Grounds: possession of state secrets by virtue of her access to foreign publications and contacts with foreign nationals through academic conferences. Yelena had never attended a conference outside the Soviet Union. Her access to state secrets consisted of French novels available in the Lenin Library. She was summoned to the Institute Director's office on April the 9th. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. She was informed that her contract would not be renewed beyond the current academic term. The decision was presented as budgetary, a reduction in research positions. The director, Professor Dmitry Kalinin, did not meet her eyes during the conversation. Her dismissal took effect on May 31, 1978. Under Soviet law, unemployment was illegal. Every citizen capable of work was required to work. Those who did not work faced charges of parasitism. The sentence for parasitism could include internal exile or forced labor. Yelena was given a work assignment in June. She reported to chemical plant number 17 in Khimki, a Moscow suburb approximately 20 kilometers from the city center. The plant manufactured industrial solvents. Her job involved quality control documentation, recording pH levels, temperature readings, production volumes. She worked 8-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The pay was 87 rubles monthly, less than half what she'd earned at the institute. The surveillance began almost immediately after her visa denial. Declassified KGB reports from the Moscow City Directorate, released in stages between 1991 and 1998, document the attention paid to Yelena Volkova. File reference 22847TM contains 237 pages of surveillance logs, contact reports, and operational notes covering the period from April 1978 through November 1979. Her case officer was Captain Grigory Sokolov, Second Chief Directorate, department responsible for monitoring Soviet citizens with foreign contacts or emigration applications. Sokolov was 34 years old, a career officer who had joined the KGB in 1969 after military service. His personnel file describes him as methodical and persistent in operational work. The surveillance followed standard protocol. Her telephone was monitored. Her mail was opened and photographed before delivery. Her apartment, a single room in a communal flat on Tverskaya Street, was searched at least twice, once in July 1978 and again in February 1979. The searches were conducted while she was at work. Nothing was taken, but items were deliberately displaced so she would know someone had been inside. Informants were cultivated among her neighbors and co-workers. A woman named Ludmila Markov, who worked alongside Yelena at the chemical plant, submitted weekly reports on Yelena's behavior, conversations, and contacts. These reports, preserved in the file, are banal. Subject arrived on time, spoke little, ate lunch alone, left promptly at end of shift. The trap being constructed around Yelena was patient and systematic. Sokolov met with her 4 times between May 1978 and October 1979. The meetings occurred at various locations, twice at KGB offices on Lubyanka Square, once at a cafe near the Kursky railway station, once at the chemical plant. Each meeting followed a similar pattern. Sokolov would begin with pleasantries. He would ask about her work, her health, her adjustment to factory life. Then he would transition to the actual purpose. He wanted names. Specifically, he wanted the names of other refuseniks she might know, foreign nationals she'd corresponded with during her academic career, anyone who might be assisting her in her emigration attempt. In exchange, he suggested, her situation might improve. Perhaps her visa application could be reconsidered. Perhaps a better work assignment could be arranged. Yelena refused each time. The refusals were polite, but absolute. She had no information to provide, she explained. She knew no one engaged in illegal activity. She had no contacts with foreign intelligence services. She simply wished to join family abroad. Contact with Irina became dangerous after Yelena's visa denial, but Yelena maintained it anyway. She called her sister every few weeks, keeping the conversations brief and superficial. She wrote letters, equally innocuous. She understood that everything was monitored. She accepted this as the cost of maintaining the connection. In August 1979, the sisters developed a coded system during a brief visit Irina made to Moscow. The code was simple, almost childishly transparent, but it provided a minimal layer of protection. References to grandmother's recipes meant problems with authorities. Flour indicated documentation. Baking time suggested deadlines or time pressure. They both knew the code would fool no one who paid close attention, but it might provide plausible deniability. A conversation about recipes was not, on its surface, political. What precipitated the November 3rd call was Yelena's final refusal to cooperate. On October 31, 1979, Captain Sokolov summoned her to a meeting. This time, the location was a Trinity, unmarked office building near Sokolniki Park. The room was small, windowless, furnished with a metal table and 3 chairs. Sokolov was not alone. A second officer, whose name was not recorded in the declassified documents, sat in the corner taking notes. The tone had changed. Sokolov was no longer offering inducements, he was making demands. Yelena had been observed in the company of known refuseniks, he said. She had been seen near the apartment of a foreign journalist. These activities suggested coordination with anti-Soviet elements. The accusation was absurd. The foreign journalist was a French cultural attaché whose name had appeared in a newspaper article Yelena happened to read at the library. She had never met him. The coordination existed only in fabricated surveillance reports, but the fabrication was the point. Sokolov was constructing a case. He gave Yelena a choice: provide detailed testimony about her contacts with foreign nationals and other refuseniks, or face prosecution under Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. She had 72 hours to decide. The meeting concluded at 3:45 p.m. 72 hours from that moment would be November 3rd at 3:45 p.m. Yelena spent the next 2 days considering her options. There were no good options. If she provided false testimony implicating others, she became complicit in the machinery destroying people's lives. If she refused, she faced arrest, trial, and imprisonment. On the evening of November 2nd, she decided to warn Irina. The warning served multiple purposes. It alerted her sister to the danger. It might also complicate Sokolov's plans if he learned Yelena had reached out to family. Most importantly, it gave Yelena a chance to say goodbye to someone who mattered before whatever came next. She placed the call at 9:15 a.m. on November 3rd. She knew the line was monitored. She knew the coded language would be transparent to anyone listening. She made the call anyway. Years later, in an interview conducted in Tel Aviv in 1991, Yelena would describe that phone call as the worst decision she ever made. Not because of what it cost her, she expected consequences for herself, but because of what it cost Irina. She had wanted to warn her sister. Instead, she had pulled her into the trap that had been set. Natasha Volkova returned home from school number 147 at 2:45 p.m. to find her mother packing a suitcase. In an interview conducted in Berlin in 2003, Natasha described the scene with the clarity of memory that has been examined and re-examined over decades. She had come through the door carrying her school bag, already thinking about homework she needed to complete. The apartment was quiet except for sounds coming from the bedroom. She found Irina kneeling on the floor beside an open canvas bag, folding a sweater. "Mama," Natasha stood in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Irina looked up. Her face was composed, but Natasha noticed her mother's hands moving with unusual quickness, an efficiency that suggested urgency poorly disguised as routine. "I need to go to Moscow for a few days," Irina said. "Aunt Yelena is sick." Natasha was 11 years old enough to understand that sickness could be serious, young enough to accept the explanation at face value, at least initially. "What kind of sick?" "She has a fever. She needs help." Irina returned her attention to the bag, adding toiletries, a second shirt. "I'm taking the evening train. I'll be back soon." Mikhail arrived at 3:05. He came through the door with the scattered energy typical of 8-year-old boys, dropping his bag on the floor, calling out for his mother. He found both women in the bedroom, Natasha sitting on the edge of the bed, Irina closing the latches on the now packed bag. "Where are you going?" Mikhail's confusion was immediate and visible. His mother rarely traveled. The suitcase represented disruption to routine. Irina repeated the explanation. Aunt Yelena was sick. She needed to go to Moscow. She would be back in 3 days, maybe 4 at most. The details she provided were minimal and practical. She told them their father would be home soon. Aunt Galina, Victor's sister, would come stay with them while she was gone. They were to behave, attend school, complete their homework. Normal instructions for a normal absence. The details she omitted were everything else. She did not mention the phone call. She did not explain why Aunt Yelena, who had other friends in Moscow, specifically needed help from Leningrad. She did not acknowledge that going to Moscow meant defying Victor's explicit instructions to maintain distance from Yelena. She did not tell them she was afraid. Victor returned at 4:30 p.m. According to City Planning Department shift records, he left work at 4:05, citing a family emergency. Someone had called him. Natasha would later speculate it was Mrs. Antonova, the neighbor, who had seen Irina packing and decided Victor should know. Mrs. Antonova denied making such a call, but the timing suggests someone alerted him. He came through the door already tense. He saw the packed bag in the hallway. He found Irina in the kitchen, preparing an early dinner for the children, potatoes and kasha, something simple they could finish themselves. "What are you doing?" His voice was low but sharp. "I need to speak with you." Irina glanced toward the main room where the children sat. "Privately." They went into the bedroom and closed the door. The wall separating the bedroom from the main living space was thin, constructed of wooden studs with plaster over lath. Sound traveled easily. Natasha, doing homework at the small table near the window, could hear the conversation clearly despite the lowered voices. She recalled fragments in the 2003 interview. Victor's first question, "When did she call?" Irina's response, barely audible. Then Victor's voice rising slightly, "You know what this means? You know what they'll do." Mikhail, less interested in adult conversations, played on the floor with a set of wooden blocks, but even he registered the tension, the urgency in his father's tone. The argument continued for approximately 20 minutes. Through the wall came the sound of Victor pacing, his footsteps crossing the small room repeatedly. Irina's voice remained calmer, but there was a brittleness to it, a quality Natasha had never heard before. At one point, Victor said something about throwing everything away. Irina's response was inaudible. Then Victor again. "I can't protect you if you do this. You understand that? I can't protect any of us." According to divorce proceedings filed in March 1980, Victor testified that he gave Irina an ultimatum that afternoon. The exact words were recorded in the court transcript. "I told her that if she went to Moscow, if she involved herself in her sister's situation, she was choosing her sister over her family. Over our children, I told her I would not allow her choices to destroy what we had built. The choice Irina faced was impossible, in the way choices under totalitarian systems are always impossible. If she went to Moscow, she risked everything Viktor had described, his career, their apartment, their children's future. If she stayed, she abandoned her sister at the moment Yelena most needed help. Either choice was a betrayal. The bedroom door opened at 5:30. Irina emerged first. Her face was carefully neutral, though her eyes were red in a way that suggested recent tears. Viktor followed, his expression rigid. Irina returned to the kitchen. She finished preparing dinner. She set the table, called the children to eat. The meal was silent. Mikhail asked once when she was leaving. "Soon," she said. "After dinner." The half-packed suitcase remained in the hallway. Irina had left it incomplete, perhaps hoping until the last moment that Viktor would relent, that some compromise might be found. At 6:02, she went to the bedroom and added the few remaining items: a book, her good shoes, the internal passport she would need for travel. The children stood in the narrow hallway as she prepared to leave. Mikhail's face showed confusion more than distress. He still didn't grasp that his mother's departure was anything other than a brief trip. Natasha understood more. Her expression, in her own later description, reflected a kind of frozen watchfulness, like I was trying to memorize everything. Viktor stood apart, near the kitchen doorway. He did not approach. He did not say goodbye. Irina knelt down in front of her children. She pulled them close, first Natasha, then Mikhail, then both together. She held them longer than a normal goodbye would require. "I'll be back in 3 days," she said. 4 at most. Be good for your father." Natasha would remember years later the feeling of her mother's arms around her, the smell of the soap Irina used, the texture of her wool sweater. She would remember thinking, even then, that something was wrong, that her mother was holding on, as if letting go required conscious effort. Irina stood, picked up the bag, and walked to the door. Her last image, as Natasha recalled it, was her mother in the doorway, turned back for one final look. The hallway light was behind her, making her face difficult to see clearly. She raised one hand, a wave, or perhaps just a gesture of acknowledgement. Then she was gone, the door closing with the soft click of the latch engaging. It was 6:15 p.m. on November the 3rd, 1979. Natasha returned to her homework. Mikhail returned to his blocks. Viktor stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. The promise Irina had made, 3 days, 4 at most, would prove to be one she could not keep. Irina Volkova never reached Moscow. The arrest occurred at Moscow Station in Leningrad at 11:40 p.m. on November the 3rd, 1979. She had purchased a ticket for the overnight train, scheduled to depart at 11:55 p.m. She was standing on platform 7, approximately 15 meters from the carriage door, when 2 men in civilian clothes approached from opposite directions. Lieutenant Fyodorov identified himself first. He was 31 years old, thin, with a narrow face and wire-rimmed glasses. Sergeant Petrov, his partner, was younger, perhaps 26, broader in build. Both carried identification folders with the distinctive crimson KGB credential cards. Fyodorov asked to see her documents. Irina produced her internal passport. He examined it with deliberate slowness, comparing the photograph to her face, checking the registration stamp, running his finger along the edge as if testing for forgery. "You are Irina Petrovna Volkova?" Yes? You need to come with us. The charges were read in a small office adjacent to the station security checkpoint. Anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, maintaining contacts with foreign elements engaged in activities harmful to the Soviet state. The language was formal, bureaucratic, delivered in a tone that suggested this was routine procedure. Irina was permitted to collect her bag. She was not handcuffed. The arrest appeared casual, almost polite, but the two officers positioned themselves on either side of her as they walked through the station. Anyone watching would understand she was in custody. They drove her to Bolshoi Dom, the big house, KGB headquarters on Litainy Prospect. The building was 7 stories of constructivist architecture built in the 1930s, its facade the color of dried blood under the sodium streetlights. People in Leningrad did not speak its name aloud unless necessary. She was processed through a ground-floor intake room. Personal effects inventoried, 1 small canvas bag containing clothing, toiletries, 47 rubles in cash, internal passport, a book. The items were logged on a form, deposited in a manila envelope, locked in a cabinet. She was photographed from the front and both sides. Her fingerprints were taken, each finger rolled across an ink pad and pressed onto a card marked with her name and the date. The interrogation room was on the 3rd floor. Concrete block walls painted institutional green. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, unshaded, casting harsh shadows. A metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, also metal. A radiator under the small window produced uneven heat. The space alternated between stifling and cold, depending on proximity to the source. The first interrogation session began at 3:00 a.m. on November 4th. Major Konstantin Orlov entered the room carrying a thick folder and a thermos of tea. He was 48 years old, a career officer who had spent 20 years with the 2nd Chief Directorate, the division responsible for internal security and surveillance of Soviet citizens. His personnel file, declassified in portions after 1991, described him as thorough and effective in extracting reliable testimony. He poured himself tea, but offered none to Irina. He opened the folder, removed several documents, and arranged them on the table with precise movements. Then he looked at her for the first time. "Tell me about your sister's activities in Moscow." The questioning continued for 6 hours. Orlov's technique, described in later testimony by other prisoners who passed through his interrogations, relied on exhaustion and repetition. He would ask the same question in slightly different forms, waiting for inconsistencies or contradictions. He presented evidence slowly, watching for reactions. He alternated between conversational tones and sudden aggression, keeping subjects off balance. He asked about Yelena's foreign contacts. Did Irina know the names of anyone Yelena had corresponded with abroad? Had Yelena mentioned plans to transmit materials out of the country? What was the nature of Yelena's employment before her dismissal from the institute? Irina answered truthfully. She knew very little. She had not seen Yelena frequently in recent years. Their contact was minimal, supervised, careful. Orlov produced the first piece of evidence, a transcript of the telephone call from that morning, the conversation about grandmother's recipe, the coded language about special flour. He read portions aloud, his voice flat and neutral. What did she mean by special flour? I don't know. You understood her immediately. You agreed to travel to Moscow within seconds. My sister said she was in trouble. I wanted to help. He moved to the next document. Phone records spanning 14 months, a detailed log of every call between Irina's number and Yelena's Moscow apartment. 23 calls total. The dates, times, and durations were highlighted in yellow ink. Then letters. 6 letters Irina had written to Yelena, intercepted and photographed before delivery. The content was innocuous: updates about the children, brief comments about work, wishes for Yelena's health. But Orlov pointed to specific phrases. "I hope things improve for you soon. Stay strong. We think of you often." These are coded messages of support for anti-Soviet activity. They're expressions of concern for my sister. Your sister is attempting to flee the Soviet Union. By maintaining contact, you're providing encouragement for this betrayal. The distinction between sisterly affection and political conspiracy was one Orlov refused to acknowledge. Everything Irina said was reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. Every relationship became a network. Every expression of care became evidence of coordination. At 7:30 a.m., he shifted focus to Irina's own correspondence. Had she maintained contact with anyone outside the Soviet Union? Had she expressed dissatisfaction with Soviet life? Had she discussed emigration? The answer to all these questions was no. Irina had written no letters abroad. She had no foreign contacts. She had never applied for emigration. Her political reliability until this moment had been unquestioned. But Orlov already knew this. The questions weren't seeking new information. They were building a record, creating a documented pattern of interrogation that would support whatever conclusion had already been reached. What they wanted her to confirm was simpler: that Yelena was engaged in anti-Soviet activity, that she had recruited others, that there existed a network of collaborators. "Give us names," Orlov said. "Tell us who else your sister has involved. Help us understand the full scope of this operation." Irina refused. There was no operation. There was no network. Yelena wanted to leave the country to join family abroad. That was not a crime. Orlov closed the folder at 9:00 a.m. He stood, collected his thermos, and walked to the door. "You'll remain in detention pending further investigation," he said. "We'll continue this conversation when you're ready to be more cooperative." She was held in preliminary detention at Bolshoi Dom for 4 days. The cell was small, perhaps 2 meters by 3 meters, containing a metal cot, a bucket, and nothing else. She was given water twice daily and a meal of thin soup and bread once each evening. The light remained on continuously. The heating was erratic. She was interrogated 3 more times, November 5th, 6th, and 7th. Different investigators, same questions. Each session lasted between 4 and 8 hours. Each followed the same pattern: accusations, evidence presented, demands for names and confirmation. She gave them nothing beyond what they already possessed. On November the 8th, she was transferred to Kresty Prison, the pre-trial detention facility on the Arsenal embankment. The building dated from 1892, a massive cross-shaped structure designed to hold 1,750 prisoners, but housing, by 1979, nearly 4,000. Her cell measured 3 meters by 4 meters. She shared it with 3 other women. One was awaiting trial for theft, another for prostitution. The third, a woman named Olga, who never provided her surname, was also charged under Article 70. She'd been detained 6 months earlier for distributing religious literature. The cot frames were bolted to the walls. Each woman had approximately 1 meter of personal space. The toilet was a hole in the floor in the corner, partially concealed by a thin curtain. The window was high and barred, admitting grey daylight that revealed nothing of the world outside. Irina would remain in Kresty for 11 weeks, awaiting trial. During that time, she was not permitted visitors. She was allowed to send 1 letter monthly to family. She received none in return. She did not know if her letters were being delivered or if Victor had chosen not to respond. She did not know what her children had been told. She did not know if they asked about her or if they'd been instructed to forget. She did not know if Yelena had been arrested as well or if her warning call had been in vain. What she knew was contained within the four walls of the cell and the information her cellmates shared. Olga had been interrogated 17 times before her case went to trial. The process was slow, methodical, designed to break resistance through attrition. Some people confessed to things they hadn't done simply to make it end. Irina resolved not to confess. She had done nothing wrong. She had tried to help her sister. If that was a crime in the eyes of the state, then the state itself was criminal. It was a principled position. It would prove irrelevant. On November the 5th, 1979, 2 KGB officers arrived at school number 147 during morning lessons. Marina Petrova, who taught mathematics to the fifth-year students, was conducting a lesson on fractions when the classroom door opened without warning. The school director, Comrade Sokolov, entered, accompanied by 2 men in dark overcoats. They spoke briefly to Sokolov in lowered voices, then waited by the door while he approached Petrova's desk. "Natasha Volkova needs to come with us," he said quietly. Natasha gathered her books. The classroom had gone silent, 30 pairs of eyes watching. She walked to the front of the room, her face pale but composed. The men did not introduce themselves. One placed a hand on her shoulder, not roughly but firmly, and guided her into the hallway. In a statement given to education authorities in 1980, Petrova described the incident as highly irregular and disturbing to classroom order. She noted that several students became visibly upset. One girl began crying. Petrova was given no explanation at the time and was instructed not to discuss the matter with other students. Mikhail was retrieved from his third-year classroom at the same time. His teacher, Vera Dmitrievna, later reported that he resisted leaving, asking repeatedly where they were taking him and when his mother would come. The officers did not answer his questions. They escorted both children to the director's office where Victor was waiting. He had been summoned from work an hour earlier. The meeting lasted approximately 15 minutes. Victor was informed that given recent developments regarding his wife's arrest, it would be advisable to remove the children from school number 147. The phrasing was carefully neutral, advisable, not required. But the implication was clear. Victor brought the children home. He did not return to work that day. That evening, he went back to the school alone for a meeting with Director Sokolov. The conversation, reconstructed from Sokolov's notes preserved in archived city education files, focused on damage control. The other students needed an explanation. Rumors were already circulating. The official line would be that Irina Volkova had been transferred for work reasons to another city, and the children would be joining her after the current term concluded. No mention of arrest, no mention of charges. The fiction was thin, but it served its purpose. The immediate social consequences for Natasha and Mikhail were severe and comprehensive. By November 6th, classmates who had been friendly the previous week no longer spoke to them. At lunch, the seats beside Natasha remained conspicuously empty. Mikhail found himself excluded from games during recreation periods. Children who had been at his birthday party 4 months earlier turned away when he approached. The parents had spoken to their children. The message varied in specifics, but arrived at the same conclusion. Stay away from the Volkov children. Association with the family of an enemy of the state carried risk. Better to maintain distance. Teacher reports from November and December 1979, archived in the Leningrad City Education Administration files, document the atmosphere. One report notes persistent whispering among students regarding the Volkov situation. Another records that Natasha's academic performance remained strong despite obvious distress. A third mentions Mikhail's increased aggression on the playground, pushing a classmate, refusing to follow instructions, shouting at his teacher. Victor attempted to maintain normalcy within the apartment. He woke the children at the usual time. He made breakfast, though his cooking lacked Irina's efficiency. He ensured they dressed properly for school, completed their homework, maintained their routines. The effort was visible and largely unsuccessful. His sister Galina moved in on November the 7th to help. She was 41 years old, a widow whose own children were grown. She took over the domestic tasks Victor handled poorly: cooking, laundry, managing the shared bathroom schedule with the other families. She slept on a folding cot in the main room, her few possessions kept in a canvas bag beside the wall. The children asked questions Victor couldn't answer. Where was their mother? When would she return? Why had she been arrested? What had she done wrong? Victor's responses, according to Natasha's later recollection, were variations on the same theme. Your mother made a mistake. She'll be home when this is resolved. Everything will be fine. Mikhail asked if they could visit her. Victor said no, not yet. Mikhail asked if she'd done something bad. Victor said it was complicated. Mikhail asked if she still loved them. Victor's silence lasted long enough that Mikhail began crying. Neighbor testimony from the period documents disturbing changes in Mikhail's behavior. Mrs. Antonova, the widow who shared their communalka, reported hearing the boy screaming in his sleep multiple nights in mid-November. The screams would wake the entire corridor. Victor would go to him, speaking in low, soothing tones until the child quieted. Natasha displayed a different response. At 11 years old, she possessed understanding that exceeded her age. She stopped asking questions after the first week. She helped Aunt Galina with household tasks without being asked. She watched her father carefully, monitoring his moods, adjusting her behavior to avoid adding to his burden. In her 2003 interview, she described this period as the moment she learned to become invisible. I understood that my father was barely holding things together. I couldn't add to his problems. So I became very quiet, very self-sufficient. I think I stopped being a child then. Victor wrote letters between November the 5th and December the 31st, 1979. He composed and sent 14 letters to various authorities. 3 went to the Leningrad KGB Directorate, requesting information about his wife's case. 2 went to the city prosecutor's office, asking about visitation rights. 4 went to Irina's assigned defense attorney, Boris Lebedev, seeking updates on trial preparation. The remaining 5 were addressed to party officials, former colleagues, anyone who might have influence. Most received no response. Those that did offered formulaic acknowledgements and no substantive information. On December 15th, Victor submitted a formal petition for clemency. The document, preserved in case files, runs to 3 pages. He outlined Irina's previously unblemished record, her contributions as an engineer, her role as a mother. He argued that her actions stemmed from family loyalty rather than political motivation. He requested leniency in sentencing, or alternatively, permission for the children to visit their mother in detention. The response arrived on January the 12th, 1980. The petition was denied, no explanation provided. The letter was signed by a deputy prosecutor whose name was illegible. The children's last day at school number 147 was December 20th, 1979, the final day before winter break. Natasha cleaned out her desk in silence. She carried home her textbooks, notebooks, the small pencil case her mother had given her the previous September. Several classmates watched, but no one said goodbye. Her teacher, Marina Petrova, stopped her briefly at the door and pressed a small wrapped package into her hands, a book of poetry purchased with Petrova's own money. "For your studies," she said quietly. Mikhail's departure was less composed. He threw his books into his bag with enough force that one tore. When his teacher tried to speak to him, he turned away. He walked home alone, 20 minutes behind Natasha, arriving red-faced and refusing to explain why. They did not return after winter break. Their transfer to school number 203 took effect on January 14, 1980. The new school was across the city, nearly an hour by trolleybus from their apartment. It was larger, more crowded, located in a district where no one knew their family or their history. The placement was deliberate. Victor had requested a school far from their neighborhood, somewhere the children might have a chance to start fresh. The Education Administration approved the transfer with unusual speed. On their first day, Natasha and Mikhail were introduced to their new classmates as students who had recently moved to the district. The lie was maintained. For a few weeks, it almost worked. Mikhail made a friend, a boy named Andrei, who invited him to play football. Natasha joined a study group preparing for exams. But secrets in the Soviet system had a way of traveling. By February, whispers had begun again. Someone's parent knew someone who knew about the Volkov case. The information spread in the peculiar way that sensitive information always spread, through lowered voices, knowing looks, subtle acts of exclusion. The children learned that geography couldn't solve their problem. The stigma followed them. It would continue to follow them through school, through university applications, through every interaction with authorities who reviewed documents and saw their mother's name linked to a criminal case. Their new reality was one of permanent suspicion, where who they were mattered less than who their mother had been. Where a phone call made on a November morning had altered not just the trajectory of their lives, but the fundamental category into which they fell, children of an enemy of the state, marked by association, diminished by proximity to her choice. The trial of Irina Volkova began on January 28, 1980, in a closed session of Leningrad City Court. Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code addressed anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. The statute criminalized the dissemination of fabrications that defamed the Soviet state, the preparation or distribution of literature with such content, or any actions undertaken with the aim of weakening Soviet power. Conviction carried a sentence of 6 months to 7 years, deprivation of freedom, with possible additional exile of 2 to 5 years. The courtroom was located on the 3rd floor of the Leningrad City Court building on Fontanka Embankment. It was small, designed for administrative proceedings rather than public trials. Wooden benches for perhaps 20 observers, a raised platform for the judge, tables for prosecution and defense positioned at angles that prevented eye contact between the two sides. The prosecution was led by State Attorney Vladimir Karpov, 44 years old, a career prosecutor who had handled political cases throughout the 1970s. His record showed a conviction rate approaching 98%. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase that he set on the table with deliberate precision. The defense was Boris Lebedev, court-appointed, 52 years old. He had met with Irina twice before the trial, each meeting lasting less than 30 minutes. During these consultations, preserved in his case notes, he advised her to plead guilty and request leniency. When she refused, he made no alternative suggestions. He would be disbarred in 1983 for administrative violations unrelated to this case. The judge was Yuri Maximovich Petrov. He was 58 years old, a party member since 1952, a veteran of Soviet legal proceedings who understood his role not as arbiter, but as facilitator of state interests. His expression throughout the trial remained neutral, almost bored, suggesting he'd presided over hundreds of similar cases and expected this one to follow familiar patterns. The trial was closed to the public. Besides court officials and the accused, only Viktor Volkov was permitted to attend. He sat alone in the second row, wearing his best suit, his hands clasped in his lap. Karpov's opening statement lasted 18 minutes. He outlined the charges with bureaucratic thoroughness. Irina Volkova had maintained sustained contact with her sister, a known refusenik who had attempted to flee the Soviet Union. She had provided moral and material support for this betrayal. She had, through coded communications, coordinated with anti-Soviet elements. Her actions constituted a deliberate effort to undermine the socialist state. The evidence was presented methodically, 23 letters written by Irina to Yelena over a 14-month period. The prosecution displayed them one at a time, reading selected passages aloud. "I hope things improve for you. Stay strong during these difficult times. We are thinking of you always." Each phrase, innocent in isolation, was reinterpreted as encouragement for illegal emigration. 47 telephone call records presented as a chart showing frequency and duration. The calls were highlighted in red ink. Karpov pointed to the pattern: increased frequency in the months following Yelena's visa denial. This demonstrated, he argued, coordinated activity. 8 witnesses testified. The first was Mrs. Antonova, the neighbor. She described hearing raised voices on November the 3rd, the day of Irina's arrest. She claimed, falsely, that she'd heard Irina speaking with an unidentified man about leaving the country. The testimony contradicted her earlier statement to investigators, but went unchallenged. The second witness was a co-worker from the Svetlana Electronics factory. He testified that Irina had once expressed frustration with shortages in state shops. This constituted, according to the prosecution, evidence of anti-Soviet sentiment. 3 witnesses were former colleagues of Yelena from the Moscow Institute of Foreign Languages. Each described Yelena's political unreliability, her associations with foreign nationals, her eventual dismissal. None had ever met Irina. Their testimony served to establish Yelena's guilt, which was then transferred by association to her sister. The remaining witnesses were identified only as informed citizens who had observed suspicious behavior. Their names were not provided to the defense. Their testimony was vague. Reports of conversations overheard, attitudes detected, associations noted. The substance mattered less than the accumulation. The specific anti-Soviet statements attributed to Irina were remarkably banal. She had allegedly said that housing conditions were inadequate, that food quality had declined, that her sister deserved the right to travel freely. Statements that, in a different context, might constitute ordinary complaints were elevated to criminal agitation. Irina's testimony, preserved in trial transcript number 412-80, was brief and direct. She confirmed that she had maintained contact with her sister. She acknowledged writing the letters and making the telephone calls. She explained that Yelena had called on November the 3rd saying she needed help, and that Irina had decided to travel to Moscow to provide it. Karpov interrupted repeatedly. "Why did your sister need help?" She said she was in trouble with the authorities. "And you rushed to assist someone engaged in anti-Soviet activity." "I rushed to assist my sister." "Did you not consider the political implications?" "I considered that my sister needed me." The exchange continued for 40 minutes. Karpov pressed her to denounce Yelena, to acknowledge that her sister's emigration attempt was a betrayal of the motherland. Irina refused. She would not characterize Yelena's actions as criminal. She would not provide names of other refuseniks. She would not express remorse for trying to help family. Her position was principled and, from a legal standpoint, disastrous. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized betrayal. Karpov spoke for 32 minutes, building toward a rhetorical crescendo. The Soviet Union has provided Irina Volkova with education, employment, housing, medical care. In return, she has chosen to support those who would abandon the socialist motherland. She has placed family loyalty above loyalty to the state. This cannot be tolerated. The defense's effort was perfunctory. Lebedev rose and spoke for 12 minutes. He suggested that Irina's actions stemmed from confusion rather than malice, that she was a devoted mother who had made an error in judgment, that she had no prior criminal record and posed no genuine threat. He requested leniency but advanced no substantive legal argument. He called no witnesses. He challenged none of the prosecution's evidence. When he finished, Irina looked at him with an expression that witnesses later described as contempt mixed with resignation. She had expected little from her court-appointed attorney. He had delivered exactly that. Judge Petrov called a recess for deliberation at 3:45 p.m. The deliberation lasted 35 minutes. Court reconvened at 4:20 p.m. Petrov read the verdict from a prepared text. Guilty on all counts. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendant had shown no remorse. The sentence, 5 years corrective labor in a corrective labor colony to be served in the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The sentence fell at the lower end of what Article 70 permitted. This could be interpreted as mercy, though 5 years in a labor camp was hardly merciful. More likely, the judge recognized that the case was weak, the evidence circumstantial, and a harsher sentence might invite unwanted scrutiny during appeal. Irina's reaction, according to guards present, was minimal. She stood when directed. She listened to the sentence without visible emotion. When asked if she understood the verdict, she said yes. When asked if she had anything to say, she said no. She was escorted from the courtroom at 4:35 p.m. Victor remained seated, staring at the empty space where she had stood. The appeals process began on February 3rd, when Lebedev filed the required paperwork with the Leningrad Regional Court. The appeal argued that the sentence was excessive, given the defendant's lack of prior criminal history. It did not challenge the verdict itself or question the validity of the evidence. The appeal was denied on February 28th. The decision, issued in a single-page document, stated that the original verdict was legally sound and appropriately considered all relevant factors. Victor attended the trial alone. He did not bring the children. The decision was practical. The trial was scheduled during school hours. Removing Natasha and Mikhail would have required explanations to administrators who were already watching the family closely. Moreover, Victor wanted to shield them from seeing their mother in that context, standing in a defendant's box, accused of crimes against the state, powerless before the machinery grinding her down. He told them nothing immediately after the verdict. He returned home that evening at his usual time. He ate dinner with them, helped Mikhail with arithmetic homework, listened to Natasha read aloud from a book. He maintained the fiction that everything was proceeding normally. But children sense what adults try to hide. Natasha noticed her father's hands shaking as he poured tea. She saw the way he stared at nothing during dinner, his food largely untouched. She knew something had happened but didn't ask. Victor waited until March to tell them about the trial and the sentence. He chose a Saturday morning when Aunt Galina had gone to market. He sat them down at the kitchen table and explained with halting words and long pauses that their mother had been found guilty, that she would be going away for several years, that they would not be able to see her for some time. Mikhail asked when she would come home. Victor said 5 years, but perhaps less with good behavior. Mikhail, who was 8 years old, could not conceptualize 5 years. He asked if that was a long time. Victor said yes. Natasha asked where she was being sent. Victor said a camp in Mordovia, far to the southeast. Natasha asked if they could visit. Victor said, no, not yet, maybe later. Natasha asked if their mother was being hurt. Victor said no, she would be working, she would be safe. He was lying about the last part, and Natasha knew it. Viktor Volkov filed for divorce on March 15, 1980, citing irreconcilable differences. The legal requirement was straightforward. To maintain party standing and continue employment in the city planning department, Victor needed to demonstrate clear separation from politically unreliable elements. His wife had been convicted under Article 70. Her status as an enemy of the state rendered her a permanent liability. Association with her, even through marriage, threatened his position. The pressure had been building since November. Victor's personnel file, declassified in 1993, contains a series of memoranda from his supervisors documenting increasing concern about his reliability. The first, dated November 12, 1979, noted that his wife had been detained on serious charges and recommended monitoring his work performance and associations. A second memo, from December the 4th, suggested that continuation in his position might be incompatible with maintaining family ties to a convicted criminal. A third, dated January 30th, 2 days after the trial, stated explicitly that divorce proceedings should be initiated to clarify the comrade's political position. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Divorce or dismissal. Those were the options. The choice Victor faced was different from Irina's, but equally impossible. She had chosen between her sister and her family. He was being asked to choose between his wife and his children's future. If he lost his position, he lost the apartment, lost access to decent schools, lost the minimal protections party membership provided. His children, already stigmatized by their mother's conviction, would be further marginalized. He made the calculation that Irina, in similar circumstances, might have made. He chose the living over the imprisoned, the children he could still protect over the wife he could not. The divorce proceedings were uncontested. Soviet law permitted divorce by mutual consent or, in cases where one party was imprisoned, by unilateral petition. Victor filed the papers at the Leningrad District Registry Office on March 15th. The grounds were standard, irreconcilable differences arising from the breakdown of marital relations, no mention of Irina's conviction. The legal fiction maintained a veneer of normalcy. Irina's signature was required even for unilateral divorce. Obtaining it required coordination with camp authorities. Victor submitted the paperwork through official channels. It was forwarded to Camp Zukate 3853 in Mordovia. Irina signed the documents on April 2, 1980, in the camp administrative office, witnessed by 2 guards. According to later testimony from a fellow prisoner, Irina did not cry when she signed. She asked the guard how her children were. The guard had no information and no interest in obtaining any. She signed her name, Irina Petrovna Volkova, for what she knew might be the last time. The divorce was finalized on April 15th, 1980. Telling the children fell to Victor again. He chose a Sunday afternoon in late April after weeks of rehearsing explanations that all felt inadequate. His account, given years later to Natasha during one of their infrequent conversations after his death, described the scene as the hardest moment of his life, harder than attending the trial, harder than making the decision itself. He sat them down in the kitchen, the same place where Irina had received Yelena's phone call 5 months earlier, and explained that he and their mother were no longer married. Natasha's response was silence. She was 12 years old by then, old enough to understand that divorce meant something permanent. She asked one question. "Does she know?" Victor said yes. Natasha nodded and left the room. Mikhail's incomprehension was more complete. He asked if this meant they would never see their mother again. Victor said no, they might visit someday. Mikhail asked if their mother still loved them. Victor said of course she did. The divorce changed nothing about that. Mikhail asked why they were getting divorced then. Victor had no answer that would satisfy an 8-year-old's logic. The practical consequences extended beyond the emotional devastation. Name changes were considered. Victor's supervisors suggested that the children might adopt his sister Galina's surname, creating distance from Irina's documented criminal status. Victor rejected this. Whatever else he had sacrificed, his children would keep their names. They were Volkovs. That would not change. Other changes were unavoidable. In June 1980, they were assigned a new apartment. The city planning department, in consultation with housing authorities, determined that their current residence, shared with neighbors who had witnessed the family's disgrace, was untenable. The new apartment was smaller, 1 room instead of 2, located in a different district entirely. It was in a building that housed primarily factory workers, people too preoccupied with their own struggles to care much about political reliability. The space measured 14 square meters. Victor, Natasha, and Mikhail occupied it together. Privacy became a memory. Aunt Galina, who had been living with them since November, remained. She slept on a folding cot near the door. Her presence was essential. Victor's work schedule required someone to manage the children, but it compressed their living space to the point of constant friction. The stigma followed them regardless of geography. Children of an enemy of the state carried that designation like a brand. Teachers at school number 203 knew, administrators knew. When Natasha applied to join the Young Pioneer organization, her application was delayed for months before being quietly denied. No reason given. None needed. Surveillance continued. KGB file 7821L, the same file that contained photographs from happier times, includes surveillance reports extending through 1983. The reports documented Victor's movements, his associations, his contacts. An entry from August 1980 notes that he attended a co-worker's birthday celebration and left after 40 minutes, speaking to no one extensively. Another, from November 1981, records that he was observed at the Central Library on 3 occasions, checking out books on history and engineering. The surveillance was not intensive. Victor was not suspected of criminal activity, but it was persistent. The system wanted him to know he was watched, that any misstep would be noted, that his freedom existed at the state's discretion. Victor's health declined rapidly beginning in 1981. He was 40 years old, but looked older. Co-workers noted persistent fatigue, episodes where he seemed short of breath. In March 1981, he experienced chest pains severe enough that Galina insisted he see a doctor. The diagnosis, early cardiac problems, likely stress-related. The doctor prescribed rest and reduced workload. Victor ignored both recommendations. He could not afford to appear weak, could not give his supervisors reason to question his fitness for employment. Meanwhile, in Mordovia, Irina wrote letters. Camp regulations permitted prisoners to send 1 letter per month to family. Irina wrote religiously. 23 letters between April 1980 and November 1984. Each letter was addressed to Victor, care of the old apartment address. She had not been informed of their relocation. Each letter asked about the children, expressed love, requested photographs. The letters were intercepted. Camp mail passed through censors who read every word, redacted content deemed inappropriate, and forwarded only what they judged acceptable. Of the 23 letters Irina sent, 3 reached Victor, 3 in 5 years. The letters that arrived were heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out, sentences ending mid-thought. What remained was often innocuous to the point of meaninglessness. I am well. The work is hard, but I am managing. I think of you always. Even expressions of love for her children were sometimes removed, deemed too emotionally manipulative. Victor showed the children the 3 letters that came. He kept them in a drawer in the kitchen, wrapped in newspaper. Occasionally, Natasha would ask to see them. She would read her mother's handwriting, trying to imagine what the blacked-out sections contained. The children's confusion about why their mother stopped writing was profound and corrosive. Mikhail, particularly, could not understand. If their mother loved them, why didn't she write? Victor tried to explain that she was writing, that letters were being stopped, but this explanation required understanding a system of control that an 8-year-old could not fully grasp. Mikhail decided, with the cruel logic of childhood, that his mother had forgotten them. Natasha knew better, but couldn't articulate what she knew. Her realization came at age 13, in the autumn of 1982. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when a thought crystallized. If 3 letters had reached them in 2.5 years, and camp regulations permitted monthly correspondence, then 27 letters were missing. Her mother had not stopped writing. The state had stopped delivering. She did not share this realization with Mikhail. What would be the point? It would only replace one source of pain with another. Better to let him believe their mother had moved on than to burden him with understanding how deliberately they were being kept apart. Victor knew Natasha understood. He saw it in the way she looked at him sometimes, a kind of knowing sadness that no 13-year-old should possess. He wanted to comfort her, to explain that he had done what he believed necessary to protect them. But the words never came. The distance between what he wanted to say and what he could say had become unbridgeable. By 1983, they functioned as a family in name only. Victor worked. Aunt Galina managed the household. The children attended school, came home, completed homework, spoke little. They occupied the same 14 square meters but lived in separate emotional territories. They did not speak about Irina except in the most practical terms. Her name became something to be avoided, a topic that caused visible pain whenever it surfaced. The silence was intended as protection, but functioned as erasure. Slowly, imperceptibly, Irina was disappearing from their daily reality, not by choice, not by abandonment, but by the systematic severing of every connection that might have kept her present in their lives. Irina Volkova served her sentence at Camp Zhek 3853 in Mordovia, 600 kilometers southeast of Moscow. The camp occupied approximately 15 hectares of cleared forest near the town of Yarvas. Perimeter fencing consisted of 3 rows of barbed wire, 4 meters high, with guard towers positioned at 50-meter intervals. The complex housed roughly 800 prisoners, divided into sections based on the nature of their convictions. Irina was assigned to the political prisoners section, Barracks 7, designated for those convicted under Article 70 and related statutes. Barracks housing was standard construction for the era, wooden buildings on concrete foundations, divided into dormitory-style rooms. Each room held 20 women sleeping on 2-tier metal bunks. The space between bunks measured approximately 60 centimeters. A single wood-burning stove provided heat inadequate for Moldovan winters when temperatures regularly dropped below -20 Celsius. The work assignment was industrial sewing. The camp operated a garment factory producing military uniforms and industrial work clothes. Irina's shift ran from 7:00 a.m. to 5:00 p.m. 6 days a week, with a 30-minute break for lunch. Production quotas were enforced strictly. Failure to meet targets resulted in reduced food rations and loss of privileges. Her campmates were women whose crimes existed primarily on paper. There was Sofia, a refusenik from Kiev who had applied for emigration to Israel and been denied. There was Klavdia, a Baptist who had distributed religious literature and conducted unauthorized prayer meetings. There was Anna, a linguist who had translated foreign texts deemed subversive. Their sentences ranged from 3 to 10 years. Their commonality was that they had all, in one way or another, rejected the boundaries the state had drawn around acceptable thought and action. Daily routine was documented in camp logs, declassified in 1992. Wake up at 6:00 a.m., announced by a siren that echoed across the compound. Roll call at 6:30. Breakfast, usually kasha or thin soup with bread, at 6:45. Work began at 7:00. Prisoners walked in columns from the barracks to the factory, a distance of roughly 300 meters, regardless of weather. Lunch at noon, work resumed until 5:00. Dinner at 5:30, free time until 9:00. Lights out at 10:00. The letters Irina wrote numbered 127 over 5 years. She maintained a meticulous count in a small notebook she managed to keep hidden from searches, 1 letter each month, to Victor and the children as regulations permitted. Occasional letters to her parents, to Yelena when she knew where Yelena was. She wrote on whatever paper she could obtain, scraps from administrative offices, margins of propaganda newspapers, blank pages torn from discarded ledgers. Most letters never left the camp. Censors rejected them for containing inappropriate content, questions about the children's well-being, expressions of longing, criticism of camp conditions. Of the 3 that reached Victor, she had no way of knowing which ones had arrived. She wrote without feedback, into a void, maintaining connection through sheer force of will. Her health deteriorated in the winter of 1982. Pneumonia struck in January during a period when temperatures remained below -25 for 3 consecutive weeks. The barracks heating system failed for 2 days. Irina developed a fever, then a cough that produced bloody sputum. She continued working for 5 days before collapsing on the factory floor. The camp doctor's report, dated January 18, 1982, noted acute pneumonia, likely bacterial origin. Treatment consisted of bed rest in the barracks infirmary, a room containing 6 cots and minimal medical supplies, and administration of aspirin. No antibiotics were available. The doctor, a man named Grigory Pavlovich, who worked at the camp under compulsory assignment, wrote in his notes that proper treatment would require hospitalization. The recommendation was denied by camp administration. Irina survived through a combination of youth and luck. She was 37 years old, still physically strong despite months of inadequate nutrition. But the pneumonia left damage. The cough persisted long after the fever subsided. She had difficulty breathing during exertion. By autumn of 1982, even the minimal physical labor of operating a sewing machine left her winded. Meanwhile, 600 kilometers away, her children were growing up without her. Mikhail's behavioral problems escalated through 1981 and 1982. School reports from this period, preserved in educational archives, document increasing aggression and defiance. In March 1981, he was suspended for 3 days after fighting with a classmate. In October, he was caught stealing money from a teacher's desk. In February 1982, he refused to participate in a required political education class and was sent to the director's office. Teachers noted that he seemed angry constantly, responding to minor provocations with disproportionate rage. One report suggested psychological evaluation. The suggestion was not pursued. Resources for child psychology were limited, and families with political complications were not priorities for state services. Natasha followed a different trajectory. Her academic performance remained exceptional, despite circumstances that would have destroyed most students. She received top marks in mathematics and literature. She won a citywide science competition in 1982 with a project on electrical circuits. Teachers described her as serious, disciplined, emotionally remote. She had learned to channel everything, grief, anger, confusion, into academic achievement. It was the one domain where she maintained control, where effort produced predictable results. She studied with an intensity that worried Aunt Galina, who would find her at the kitchen table past midnight, eyes red from fatigue, still working through problem sets. Victor's death came on September 14, 1982. He was at work reviewing construction proposals in his office at the City Planning Department. A co-worker found him slumped over his desk at 2:30 in the afternoon. The heart attack was massive. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. He was 41 years old. The news reached the children that evening through Aunt Galina, who had been summoned to identify the body. Natasha, 13, received the information with the same controlled composure she applied to everything. Mikhail, 11, screamed and threw things until he exhausted himself. They were orphaned in practical terms. Their mother was alive but inaccessible, serving a sentence in a camp they'd never seen. Their father, who had sacrificed his marriage to maintain stability for them, was gone. What remained was Aunt Galina, a woman who loved them out of duty but lacked the resources, emotional and material, to provide what they needed. Custody formalization was a bureaucratic process that took 3 months. Galina filed the necessary paperwork, underwent interviews with social services, provided documentation of her housing situation and income. The state granted her legal guardianship in December 1982. The approval came with conditions: regular check-ins with social workers, verification of the children's school attendance, continued monitoring by authorities given the family's political history. The KGB's interest, which had been persistent through Victor's life, tapered after his death. Surveillance reports became less frequent. An entry from February 1983 noted that the family posed minimal security concern. Victor's attempt to distance himself through divorce had apparently convinced authorities that whatever contamination Irina represented had been contained. In the camp, Irina learned of Victor's death through a brief note delivered by the camp administrator in October 1982, nearly a month after it occurred. The note was 2 sentences. Your former husband, Viktor Volkov, died on September the 14th. Funeral arrangements have been completed. No details, no explanation, no information about how the children were managing or who was caring for them. She filed an early release petition in January 1983, arguing that her children were now without either parent and required her presence. The petition included supporting documentation from her work supervisor at the factory, who noted her exemplary work record and cooperative attitude. It was denied in March 1983. Reason given: insufficient time served, political rehabilitation incomplete. Yelena's fate followed a different trajectory. In June 1983, nearly 4 years after the events that led to Irina's arrest, Yelena was granted an emigration visa to Israel. The approval came suddenly, without explanation, part of a brief period when Soviet authorities permitted limited emigration as a diplomatic gesture toward Western nations. She departed Moscow on July 12, 1983. She wrote to Irina before leaving a letter explaining the situation, expressing guilt at leaving while Irina remained imprisoned, promising to maintain contact. The letter was intercepted. Irina never received it. Yelena carried with her photographs of the family, letters from Irina written before the arrest, and the profound burden of knowing that her phone call in November 1979 had set everything in motion. She settled in Tel Aviv, found work as a translator, built a life in a country where speaking freely carried no threat of arrest. But the guilt traveled with her. In interviews given decades later, she would describe the escape as both liberation and abandonment. She'd gotten out. Her sister remained behind, paying the price for helping her. Irina served the remainder of her sentence in ignorance of most of these developments. She did not know Victor was dead until a month after his burial. She did not know Yelena had left until years later. She did not know how her children were faring, what they thought of her, whether they remembered her face. She worked her shifts, wrote her letters, survived. The years passed with brutal slowness. Each day was nearly identical to the last, marked only by subtle changes in weather and the gradual degradation of her body. She developed chronic bronchitis. Her vision deteriorated from years of close sewing work under poor lighting. She lost weight until her clothes hung loose, her wrists showing bone structure that had never been visible before. By 1984, as her release date approached, she had spent 5 years in a kind of suspended existence. She was 39 years old, but looked 50. The woman who had picked up a telephone on a November morning in 1979 was gone, replaced by someone harder, more damaged, less certain of who she had been or who she might become. Irina Volkova was released from Camp Zhekei Srikul 3853 on November 2nd, 1984, having served her complete sentence. Her propiska, the residence permit required for legal habitation in any Soviet city, was restricted upon return to Leningrad. Former political prisoners were typically barred from residing in major cities, relegated instead to smaller towns where they could be more easily monitored. Irina was granted an exception, though the reasons remain unclear from available records. Possibly her former employment as an engineer carried weight. More likely, bureaucratic indifference resulted in her case being processed without the usual scrutiny. The assigned housing was a single room in a communal apartment in the Avtovo district, an industrial area in the southern part of the city. The building dated from the 1930s, grey concrete block construction, 6 stories, no elevator. Her room measured approximately 9 square meters. She shared a kitchen and bathroom with 4 other families. The neighbors were factory workers, pensioners, people too preoccupied with survival to care about her criminal record. Permitted employment was equally restricted. Her engineering credentials were worthless. No technical enterprise would hire someone with Article 70 on their record. She was assigned work at textile factory number 8, cleaning floors and maintaining equipment. The shift ran from 6:00 p.m. to 2:00 a.m., 6 nights a week. The pay was 72 rubles monthly, barely sufficient for food and utilities. She attempted to contact her children within days of her return. The old apartment on Moskovsky Prospect was occupied by strangers who knew nothing of the Volkov family. Directory assistants provided no listing for Viktor Volkov. She wrote to school number 203 asking if they could forward a letter. The school did not respond. She contacted the city planning department where Victor had worked, hoping someone might know the family's current address. A secretary told her, with carefully neutral politeness, that she could not provide personal information about former employees. Legal barriers proved more formidable than geographic distance had been. Aunt Galina, as legal guardian, had authority to determine who contacted the children. When Irina finally located them through a circuitous path involving former neighbors, Galina made her position clear in a terse meeting at a cafe near Finlyansky station. "They've suffered enough," Galina said. "Every time your name comes up, it causes problems. Mikhail acts out. Natasha withdraws. They need stability, not reminders of what happened." Irina argued that she was their mother, that 5 years of forced separation didn't erase that bond, that the children deserved to know she had returned, that she still loved them. Galina's response was blunt. "You chose your sister over them. You don't get to claim maternal rights now." The meeting that finally occurred took place in June 1985, 7 months after Irina's release. Galina relented, not out of compassion, but because Natasha had demanded it. Natasha was 16, old enough to insist, mature enough to recognize that avoiding her mother indefinitely was untenable. The meeting was supervised, Galina present throughout, positioned like a chaperone at a dance between strangers. The location was Tavricheski Garden, a public park where privacy was limited and emotion could be contained by the presence of others. Irina arrived early, standing near the entrance, her hands clasped together to stop them shaking. She had imagined this moment for 5 years. Now that it had arrived, she felt only dread. Natasha appeared at 2:00 p.m., walking with the controlled posture Irina remembered, but now sharpened into something harder. She was taller, no longer a child. Her face had lost its softness. She wore a dark coat and carried herself with deliberate composure. Mikhail lagged behind, sullen and resistant. He was 13, lanky and awkward, his expression oscillating between defiance and confusion. The responses to seeing their mother were starkly different, but equally devastating. Natasha approached and stopped at a distance of perhaps 2 meters. She did not embrace Irina. She did not cry. She said, "Hello, Mother," with a formality that felt rehearsed. Her questions were practical. Where was Irina living? What was she doing for work? Was she well? The conversation proceeded like an interview, devoid of warmth. Mikhail barely spoke. When Irina tried to hug him, he stiffened, enduring the contact rather than returning it. He answered questions with monosyllables. No, school was fine. Yes, he was eating properly. No, he didn't need anything. His eyes never quite met hers. The gulf that had opened during 5 years of separation was unbridgeable. Irina recognized this within the first 10 minutes. These were not the children she had left. Natasha had become someone self-sufficient and emotionally armored, someone who had learned to survive by not needing anyone. Mikhail had transformed into an angry stranger who associated his mother with abandonment and shame. She tried. She asked about their lives, their interests, their plans. She told them she had thought about them every day, that she had written letters constantly, that being separated had been the hardest thing she'd ever endured. Natasha listened with polite detachment. Mikhail stared at the ground. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. When it ended, Irina asked if she could see them again. Natasha said maybe, in a tone that meant probably not. Mikhail said nothing. They walked away with Aunt Galina, and Irina stood watching until they disappeared around a corner. She had lost them regardless of her release. The state had taken 5 years, but the damage extended far beyond the duration of her sentence. Her continued attempts at relationship were met with increasing resistance. She called Galina's apartment weekly. Sometimes Natasha would speak briefly. Mikhail never came to the phone. She sent letters that went unanswered. She suggested meetings that were declined. By autumn of 1985, contact had dwindled to occasional obligatory exchanges that satisfied form without providing substance. The broader context was beginning to shift. Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power in March 1985, bringing rhetoric about reform and openness. But Glasnost was still years away, and the apparatus of control remained intact. Irina's conviction stood. Her status as a former political prisoner continued to limit employment, housing, and social mobility. Natasha's university admission came in 1987. She had applied to Leningrad State University to study mathematics. Her grades were exceptional. Her entrance examination scores placed her in the top percentile. But her application included questions about family history, criminal records, political reliability. Party membership was required for university admission in competitive programs. To obtain party membership, Natasha needed to demonstrate ideological correctness and distance from politically unreliable elements. She drafted a formal statement, submitted in writing to the admissions committee, distancing herself from her mother's crimes. The document, preserved in university archives, described Irina's conviction as a betrayal of Soviet values that I categorically reject. It stated that Natasha had no contact with the individual in question and do not support her anti-Soviet activities. The language was clinical, the betrayal complete. Natasha was admitted to the university in September 1987. When Irina learned about the statement, through a bitter comment Galina let slip, she felt something break inside her that had somehow remained intact through 5 years in the camps. Her daughter had publicly denounced her to secure educational opportunity. The system had forced this choice, but Natasha had made it. The parallel to decisions Irina herself had made was not lost on her. Mikhail's path was more chaotic and less successful. He attended vocational school, training as an auto mechanic. He showed aptitude for the work, but lacked discipline. He was fired from his first job for absenteeism, his second for fighting with a supervisor. In 1990, at age 19, he married a woman named Svetlana, whom he'd known for 6 weeks. The marriage dissolved within a year. He drifted between jobs, apartments, relationships. When Irina tried to contact him, he refused to respond. Irina's rehabilitation came in the final years of the Soviet Union. She filed a petition in 1989 requesting that her conviction be overturned. The legal grounds were simple. Her actions had not constituted anti-Soviet agitation. Attempting to help family was not a crime. The evidence had been fabricated or misinterpreted. The petition was granted on February 14, 1991, 9 months before the Soviet Union collapsed. The court document stated that her conviction had been legally unfounded and that her civil rights were fully restored. She received no compensation, no apology, just a piece of paper declaring that the 5 years stolen from her had been a mistake. The collapse of the USSR in December 1991 came too late to matter for what she'd lost. Rehabilitation couldn't restore her relationship with her children. It couldn't return the years. It couldn't erase Natasha's denunciation or Mikhail's anger. The system that had destroyed her family was gone, but the damage remained. Final meetings with her children occurred sporadically over the next decade, each more painful than the last. Natasha completed university, obtained work as a research mathematician, and in 1993 accepted a position at a German university. She emigrated in August of that year. Before leaving, she met Irina once at a cafe. The conversation was stiff, procedural. Natasha said she would write. She didn't. Years later, contacted by researchers investigating this case, Natasha declined to discuss her mother in detail, saying only that the past is better left alone. Mikhail's contact ceased entirely by 1995. He had moved to another city, possibly Novgorod, possibly Moscow, accounts varied, and deliberately severed all connections to Leningrad and his former life. Attempts to locate him through various channels failed. Whether he wanted to be found or had simply disappeared into the chaos of post-Soviet Russia was unclear. Irina Volkova died on March 8, 2004, at age 59. The cause was complications from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the persistent damage from pneumonia contracted in the camps. She died in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, Leningrad having reclaimed its historical name, largely alone. A neighbor found her body 2 days after her death. Her funeral was attended by 3 people: the neighbor who discovered her, a former campmate from Mordovia who had maintained occasional contact, and a researcher documenting cases of Soviet political repression. Neither of her children were present. There is no evidence they were informed of her death. The question of responsibility in cases like this resists simple answers. Irina made a choice on November the 3rd, 1979. She could have refused her sister's plea for help. She could have prioritized her children's immediate welfare over her sister's desperate situation. The system that forced such choices was cruel by design, creating scenarios where any decision produced damage. But the system is gone, and what remains are the individual lives it broke. A mother who died alone, estranged from the children she'd sacrificed everything for. A daughter who carries guilt for denunciations made under duress. A son who vanished rather than confront the wreckage of his childhood. What the phone call ultimately cost was not just 5 years of freedom. It cost Irina her family in ways that extended far beyond her sentence. It cost Natasha her childhood and replaced it with survival mechanisms that precluded intimacy. It cost Mikhail a stable foundation, leaving him adrift in ways he never managed to remedy. It cost all of them the possibility of normal relationships, normal grief, normal forgiveness. The phone rang at 9:15 on a November morning, and in 90 seconds, everything changed. The consequences unfolded over decades, through courtrooms and camps, through estrangement and exile, through choices made under impossible circumstances. The machinery of totalitarian control ground them all down, each in different ways, until what remained was fragments, too damaged to reassemble into anything whole.